Douglas Stillman, and that is Lily Marquez, that is Mopal, and that is Lane Sturley. And our research studied the effects of sensory deprivation on cognition.
So our experimental study was based off of sensory deprivation, which is when you take away your senses such as the auditory senses, the visual senses, and the taste and hearing. Sensory deprivation has been known to affect emotional cognition. It can be either helpful or hurtful depending on the intervals that you give the actual sensory deprivation.
So the difference between our experiment and similar experiences that have been done studying the effects of sensory deprivation is that our experiment did not study the effects of complete sensory deprivation. And what I mean by that is we only were able to remove 2 of these senses, and that was the visual and auditory senses, so our subjects could not see or hear. And how this worked is we had 4 sensory deprivation subjects, so we had 4 people who could not see or hear, and then we had 2 social isolation subjects. And basically they would just sit in they would sit in a room on their own for the same amount of time as the sensory deprivation subjects were deprived of their senses. They acted as the control group because we wanted to see if there was a difference between people who sat by themselves in sensory deprivation and people who just sat by themselves and could see and hear and all that other stuff. So the way our experiment was structured is first we would give our subjects a cognition pretest, which lasted about 2 minutes, and then we would do the actual deprivation period, or isolation deprivation period, and then we would give them a cognition post-test, which lasted the same amount of time as the pretest. And the tests themselves were verbal scenes to be explained by the subject, so they were really simple scenes that could be imagined. It was presented to them verbally, and they were to come up with a story explaining the scenario that was described to them. And these are the supplies that we had. These are the earmuffs that we used to sort of muffle the hearing around them. And then these are the goggles that we used. We had to get swimming goggles and actually tape the lenses closed using masking tape. We actually weren't able to use the goggles because the masking tape did not effectively reduce the amount of light that they were able to see. So we actually just ended up using hoodies to cover their eyes.
So the test, we gave them questions beforehand, before the experiment and after the experiment. The questions consisted of a scenery, and all they had to do was explain the characters in the scenery. So, for example, the first one, the pretest we gave them was, a man is running along the road. Another man is running behind him, waving his hand, while a third man watches them both from behind a tree. So what they had to do was give us an explanation of what is happening. So an example of this would be, oh, well, the first guy, he's walking somewhere, to his house, and then the guy waving is, trying to get his attention, and the guy behind the tree, well, he's being a creeper. He's just watching him. And then they did the same exact thing with the post-test, and they had 2 minutes to give this explanation. They had to keep going. And then we recorded them as they did this, so we could later count their words.
All right. So we used the recording, we counted their words, and then found their average words per minute over the 2-minute period that they were answering the question. The blue bars that you can see on this chart are their scores on the pretest, and then the red bars are the scores on the post-test. The yellow bar represents the difference. You can see that on the social isolation, it was a decrease in words per minute from the pretest to the post-test, and then for the sensory deprivation group, it was actually the opposite situation, but to a smaller scale.
After the experiment ended, a participant didn't show any signs of increase or decrease in cognitions, and didn't show signs of anger either. But they did show signs of confusion and disorientations because they were sitting there for 30 minutes in the dark.
And there wasn't really an apparent decrease or increase in cognition, but as you saw on the chart just a minute ago, it was a minuscule difference. There was not that much difference in cognition of the social or sensory deprived subjects. because the similar experiment conducted using complete sensory deprivation had the subjects in complete sensory deprivation for a duration of 24 hours, which I would think would significantly impact the effect of sensory deprivation than just having them in there for 30 minutes, which is what we did.
And these are the tables with the data that we collected, the colorful ones are. And then that table in the bottom right-hand corner is actually the data from the research that we were comparing to. We actually got our questions from that research. And we did this so that we could more properly compare to see if we were getting the same results. Because they did their experiment over 24 hours, we did ours over 30 minutes. And we wanted to see how much of a difference there is. As you can see, they had much more drastic changes and scoring as compared to us.
So like here's a difference in the sensory deprivation group of the 24-hour experiment. As you can see, the sensory deprivation group lost, like their story length was much less. There was a significant decrease in story length of the sensory deprivation subjects, but when you move over to control and social isolation, it wasn't as significant, and social isolation actually increased for them. And it was just much more significant for sensory deprivation on the whole. And in case you're a little bit confused about our tables, this is the pretest table, this is the social isolation group subjects X and Y, and this is the total words of each story and average words per minute. And then over here is the difference in our table. So in sensory deprivation, they actually sort of increased in the words of their story as compared to down here, because the differences are positive. So like here's the words in the pre-test and the post-test. So it actually seems to increase their cognition if it was for 30 minutes than if it was for 24 hours. Like the base.
And several of the students reported actually feeling more focused after the period of either social isolation or sensory deprivation.
Although we did have a couple participants that did fall asleep a little bit in the sensory deprivation period, which probably skewed the results a little bit. But. And so as I said before, the other experiment seems to suggest that sensory deprivation is not good for cognition, but they had their subjects in sensory deprivation period for 24 hours, whereas we only had ours for a short time period of 30 minutes. And they suggest that the effect of sensory deprivation is dependent on time. And like I said before, there were some other fundamental differences, such as we only had visual and auditory senses removed. So that could have had an effect on the results as well. And further experimentation with sensory deprivation may determine a time threshold. And what I mean by that is there may be like a point where you can have sensory deprivation and it'll help your cognition, but if you have too much of it, it'll start to decrease, and the more you have, the worse it'll affect your cognition.
Alright, so you may be wondering why we would lock someone up in a dark room for a few hours and see what happens to them. It's because this is actually very commonly used today. That picture in the bottom left-hand corner is actually a sensory deprivation chamber of sorts. You sit there, you float in the water, and it blocks out all sound. It's completely dark. You can play music if you want, but they use it as a sort of a spa and massage type of situation. They use it as therapy. You've all heard of people who meditate. They just sit there without anything going on around them. But it's also been used as a sort of punishment. There have been prisons. I know we visited a fort at one point in which there was just a small room that they would put people in. No windows, no anything. They just put them in the small room for a few days. And so it would have lots of negative effects. We can also think of how this would affect people in things like long stays in the hospital, or orphans who never come in contact with parents.
I think social isolation tanks will become a little more prevalent in our society. Wichita actually has a spa here that provides sensory deprivation tanks. So you just go in there and float in the water. Yeah, it's pretty expensive, but if it works.
And those are our references. This is actually the experiment that we were referring to, so if you ever wanted to just kind of look at where we got some of our work from, this is the experiment right here. Any questions or comments? Yes.
So the basic idea that I'm getting in terms of just a summary short periods of time, having, blocking off the music, blocking off the computer, the auditorium, and the visual, for a short period of time, actually improves your attention and focus and ability to improve your cognition.
Yes.
So when people say that the music helps them, or that having the iPhone and the computer and the music helps them, what you're saying is by research, by looking and conducting this experiment, is it actually doesn't necessarily help. It's actually the opposite. Having deprived of some of those things for a little bit of time, that you actually have an improvement in your cognition. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, perhaps, but music can also be thought of as like a constant, like unchanging stimulus, and a constant unchanging stimulus is really similar to like white noise, and it can also have the same effect as sensory deprivation in that quiet is an unchanging stimulus because it is no stimulus, but like say a constant fan running, or even some constant like classical music playing could have the same effects as sensory deprivation without hearing.
So it's a similar situation how people may listen to the sound of rain or something when they're trying to go to sleep. It just kind of like gives you a break some time to think. You can focus on one thing at a time, and it kind of lets you clear out. A lot of the subjects reported after sitting there for a few minutes, their mind just kind of went blank. And one of the subjects even reported that he felt like his senses were stronger. One of the social isolation students, he thought he could hear things better.
And I think that's a little different, doing homework and listening to music than sitting in a room by yourself and in complete quiet and darkness. Because while you're sitting in the room, you aren't doing anything, but when you're doing homework, you're doing something. So it probably won't attribute to actually increasing your cognitive skills if you just sat there also doing something while you were in quiet.
Yes.
Walk me through your pre-test and post-test assessment when you did the intervention. But I'm kind of curious whether you used the same set of questions before you tested, had your intervention, as opposed to what you used in the post-evaluation to assess the difference in cognition.
There was one question before and one question after. The question before was the man running down the road, and the question after was the man in the phone booth. They're very similar, so that we know it's a kind of similar situation, but they're different enough that they got to come up with a different storyline to go along with it.
How many questions did you have?
We only had the two in the
You
presentation.
only had the two.
Yes, and we presented them to the same, like we presented them to the subject in the same format, so we'll use the same question for pre-test and post-test.
So how would you assess whether they were strong or problems? Given that the questions are similar, but they're probably not assessing the same thing.
Well, we would count the words in the story and I saw whether or not they had more creativity or something different than what was in their first, their pre-test. I think the pre and post tests were different enough to where they could come up with different storylines and it wasn't exactly the same as the first one. Well, yeah.
So were you assessing for creativity or were you assessing for creativity to measure for?
I think,
same?
well, me personally, creativity, but like the actual experiment, it was words that they spoke and words that we counted throughout, during 2 minutes. So,
We did
the
observe
words per minute.
we did observe a little creativity. They did fall back on a lot of similar themes from question to question. Like there was one student who used the theme of a coma and built his stories. But they were different enough, they had to come up with a different scenario leading up to that. So based on the details and I guess the word choice also, because if you're saying the same word over and over, repeating yourself over and over, that's not as much as coming up with more and more happening in the story.
We also only counted the relevant words in there, so when they spoke, when they were talking and they said like things like, or right, or yeah, like they were like correcting themselves. We didn't count those, we only counted words that were relevant to their story.
So you did your literature review. It seems that we know now that 30 minutes is not necessarily statistically significant, but 24 hours did. Did you see where the tipping point is, or where you start to see that change? Is it 15 hours? Is it 20 hours? Did you run across any data in that realm?
We do not.
It's a topic for further research. We just suggested that there may be a time threshold
experiment shows is that smaller intervals of sensory deprivation is actually helpful for you instead of harmful as the previous research was, where they were in it for 24 hours, no hearing, seeing, taste, all that, and they did worse.
Hi, could you do me a favor and go back to your data chart again?
Yes.
Your initial one that you showed us.
This one.
Okay, so did this cause you any kind of concern here? Because you've got your social isolation people that initially gave you a lot more words than your sensory deprivation people. Were you concerned at all about the quality of the people that you had doing your study? Do you see what I'm asking? Because
Yeah. I see.
I mean, there's quite a big difference between those two.
It was a little bit concerning, but just on the whole, we were just looking for not really necessarily like a quality in the story, but just if there was an increase or decrease in the length of the story.
That's why we keep the data on the difference on there.
Did
Because
you,
we're looking at change.
did you have I guess I'm saying, did you find a reason potentially between the differences in your initial pretest for your social isolation and your deprivation people?
I mean, it just,
We're talking 100 words difference on
right,
this.
well, I mean, it just could have been like different subjects, like different people had different creativity, aptitudes than other
Well,
people.
what I've noticed is that the people who are in the control group, they just so happen to be people who are really great at writing. And so they should be, I think their numbers should stay consistent at that high level, so they shouldn't have fluctuated back down to like 100 words per minute. They should have stayed, they should have just stayed at like the same level, so it should have been constant across. So I think that even though there's a big gap, it's still a constant representation of what they should have been at.